Welcome to the Security Weekly News wrap-up for the week of 9 May 2021. Elon tweets, Horse Ridge, Frag Attacks, lots of ransomware, and Fightin Joe Biden, as well as all the show updates. Stick around.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
It's the show that keeps you up to date on the latest security news twice a week. Your trusted source for accurate security information and expert analysis. It's time for Security Weekly News. Cyber criminals are working overtime. They're leveraging activity around the COVID vaccine to disguise phishing attacks, hoping to steal money or personal information from your employees or customers. The Barracuda Email Threat Scanner is a free tool you can use right now to help protect your business and ultimately your reputation. The Barracuda Email Threat Scanner analyzes your Office 365 accounts and identifies malicious emails that slip past your gateway and into inboxes. Find the cybersecurity threats hiding in your Office 365 email. Use the Barracuda Email Threat Scanner for free right now at securityweekly.com/Barracuda. With the skills gap increasing, it's more important than ever to train your staff effectively and efficiently. Offensive Security provides training for your organization designed by the same minds behind Kali Linux. Here are two recent offerings from OffSec. OffSec Academy gives you the chance to earn industry-leading OSCP certification with dedicated one-on-one mentoring. You can also try Proving Grounds Enterprise, created exclusively by Offensive Security's InfoSec experts for highly realistic simulated networks. Visit securityweekly.com/offsec to learn more.
Hello, I'm the almost fully vaccinated Doug White from Roger Williams University on the Security Weekly News wrap-up show. Let's wrap up all the show topics from this week. On Application Security Weekly number 150, John and Mike had Ankur Shah, the VP of Product Management at Prisma Cloud. Ankur was on to talk about how you realize your vision for application security, as most people don't. This is more about that whole engineering approach that I always talk about, where the engineering tradition was make it work and, safely, but that really didn't include app security. I mean, it was never really a part of app development. So today, as you try to use all the resources to develop, and app security is still backseated because it's even worse because of APIs and all the libraries and all the rest. So interesting segment for app developers. On Business Security Weekly number 216, Paul, Adrian, and Matt had Ryan Berquist, the Enterprise Solutions Engineer at Invicta Security, on to talk about the shift away from web application security, which was brought on by the pandemic and mandatory work from home, as we all know. So everybody was having to shift that up, and as they shifted gears, they didn't necessarily shift their security posture because they didn't have time. So the discussion was around the Invicta Web Application Vulnerability Report. So something interesting to check out as we sort of start to, I wouldn't say get to the end of the pandemic, but as we sort of start to coast toward the end of that road. In the second segment, news, 6 ways to spur cybersecurity board engagement, 5 key qualities of successful CISOs and how to develop them, 4 actions transformational leaders take, and of course, a lot of other stories as well. On Enterprise Security Weekly 227, Adrian, Paul, and Tyler Shields had Damon Small, the Technical Director of Security Consulting at NCC Group, who was on to talk about lessons we can all learn from the attack on the Florida water treatment facility. Now, this is a very relevant story because it is about a similar story to the Colonial Pipeline attack, which, of course, was all the rage this week. In the second segment, Artyom Holub and Austin McBride, the senior security analyst and data scientist from Cisco Umbrella, respectively, came on to talk about which recent and future threats are the biggest risk and how to create strategy to investigate threats, simplify operations, and scale security. So Cisco Umbrella is a very interesting product. Always worth listening to that. In the third segment, they had the news. On Security and Compliance Weekly number 73, Jeff, Josh, Priya, and Scott were talking with Eric Winnick, a partner at Otterborg PC, about privacy law and how rapid change in the law may have impacts on security professionals and data without a lot of notice. To me, it's a pretty interesting and relevant topic. We're seeing lots and lots of legislation going through the system now. You saw more legislation this week, whether it was executive orders, emergency orders, or actual congressional legislation getting passed, and suddenly security professionals are subject to a lot of this stuff. Just trying to keep up with changes in some of these laws is complicated, especially if you operate across state borders, national borders, and so forth. So definitely a lot of challenge. In the second segment, the same group came on and talked about hot legal topics in security. On the Security Weekly News number 121, Jason Wood was with us to talk about Tencent's research on using a Raspberry Pi to conduct attacks on cars. So, you know, most of us, if you've bought a vehicle in the last 3 or 4 years, you probably have a vehicle that is very enabled. So definitely worth checking some of that stuff out. On Paul's Security Weekly number 694 last night. First up, Alex Chevariat, the Chief Innovation Officer at Twic Security Group, joined to talk about mistakes we make in presenting ourselves in professional settings. Very interesting segment, well worth watching, involving naked hacking and all this kind of stuff. And while I can't personally imagine myself ever doing anything to offend anyone, well, you know, some of you know who you are, or may not know how to behave in polite society. Alex can help. Certainly, we've all, you know, made that horrible faux pas at a job interview or at a new job, you know, asking people, when is the baby due, kind of stuff. Yeah, don't do that stuff. In the second segment, learn to use a mask to collect information about what you're exposing to the internet. I guess that's in the same line of that first segment about what you're exposing. But this was a tech segment with configs, integration to Nmap, and using Eyewitness as screenshotting tool. So again, all the tech segments are always great on Security Weekly. And in the third segment, of course, the security news. My favorite trait of the week is going to be hubris. I've done that before. I'm going to do it again. This colonial pipeline thing really, again, illustrates the threat that we face as the world starts vetting all of our systems. So we have to go. We have to go through this again. Originally, you go back in the mid '90s, people started connecting systems together, and suddenly the shell hackers, like old mainframe people, were able to access other systems remotely, and the shell hacking community suddenly expanded beyond the local borders. I mean, I was dealing with hackers in the 80s on mainframe. They were all contained within one system, and we knew who they were. But as that expanded, suddenly you've got your mainframe is connecting via dial-up to another mainframe, and the next thing you know, people were doing all kinds of stuff. Then the interweb showed up, and people could suddenly examine completely insecure networks all over the world. I mean, back in the early 2000s, I remember going into these networks, remotely, and just being blown away by that. I could literally access every resource in some of these like university and even corporate networks back then, because they had no security at all, and it was all public IPs. So in all of these things, the basic attitude was it's too esoteric, no one should worry, and then they got hacked to pieces. I was the very first, and I've told this story before. I probably told it on here. I've told it on Security Weekly before. When I worked at a bank, I remember getting told these security problems are not to be exposed, because when we expose them, they become documented, and that means people have access to them. Doug, only you and a few other weird nerds would ever figure this out, but then people get hacked to pieces. And a lot of CEOs and others are wringing their hands and saying the horror, and think of the children, a lot of that kind of stuff. Politicians get all worked up and claim it's a commie plot and we need new laws to protect us from the horrors of hackers. So they pass laws requiring audits and such. But, here we go again. ICS. So ICS, relics of a bygone era, are all around us. They control the water, the electricity, the stoplights, HVAC, elevators, fire detection, you name it. There's an ICS somewhere that's running it. And it was probably developed in the 1960s. You want to make giant rolls of paper in a massive factory? Well, there's ICS for you. Now, the tradition was that there were two networks in the ICS space, the IT and the OT. And the OT, or the Operational Technology Network, was supposed to be completely isolated, and it was often isolated because it was esoteric. It didn't connect to anything, and that basically puts you back into that physical security space being the only real threat. These things range from ultra-modern controllers to ancient Rube Goldberg gadgets, a lot of levers and steam whistles. But now, the idea that these things were so weird, esoteric, sophisticated, or just plain old is back into that security through obscurity idea that that has haunted all of us forever. But traditionally, the old sawmill was using some custom operating system that was written by a guy named Rick back in the 70s, and it was using hardware built in the 60s. And the truth is, they were probably right. That stuff was so esoteric that nobody could probably figure out how to hack it, if they could even get to it at all, because it probably wasn't connected to anything. Or it was connected to an old, like an old AS400 that was sitting in a closet somewhere covered in sawdust. Actually saw that once. The internet could never touch this stuff, but then came IIoT and Wi-Fi and all that stuff. And suddenly all those OT networks had Bluetooth sensors being added to them that needed to use the cloud. Add a rule to your security. The steam whistle was replaced with a digital accordion that could be played with an iPhone, and now it needs updates to deal with iOS 14, so add another rule. Next thing you know, that OT was not so hidden. And even when it was, if the people managing it use the IT, which they should, and the IT has access to the OT somehow, and we can't just head down into the tunnel anymore with a monkey wrench and a guy named Marco who, and Marco could apparently see in the dark. That really happened too. But if the IT no longer works, we may not even be able to get to the OT, let alone activate it or control it, so we have to shut it down. If the OT is perfectly safe because it's running OS 2 Warp, well, all this comes crashing together with professional hacker criminals who want to ransomware big-time operations. Because guess what? They pay, and we'll get to that in a minute. And you get this sort of sea foam of acronyms, hackers, guys named Luigi with large pipe wrenches and raw sewage. Mix all that together, and you got a party. Now, if you make all that critical to day-to-day operations of everyone around, you got a real party, like Florida style, with guys named Joe Bob filling up trash bags with unleaded in the trunks of their cars. Now, we have got to get a handle on these systems, or someone else is going to do it for us. It's the same sermon I was preaching in 1986. I mean, I remember giving this same speech back in 1986, and today, once again, politicians will wring their hands, we'll get to that in a minute, pass toothless laws called the Peace, Freedom, and Apple Pie Act that won't do much, and hackers are going to keep on hitting infrastructure until something really bad happens. And then they may finally, at some point, have to pass legislation that would require some sort of security certification of systems. Wait, we're going to get to that too. Or they won't, and we'll just keep playing this game forever. Hey, it keeps us all employed, right? And now all those things I told you we were going to get to later. So here it is, Colonial Pipeline, now a household word that no one knew about 2 weeks ago. They paid up. So the big breaking story was that they did pay the ransom. In fact, they paid $5 million in Bitcoin to DarkSide to get the decryption key, which apparently they did get. So a week ago, if you've been under a rock or you've been waiting in line at the gas station wondering what was going on, the pipeline provider for gas and oil on the East Coast, so they provide about half of all the gas and oil to everything from Texas, which is not really East Coast, but all the way across the Southeast and all the way up into New Jersey, they got hit with ransomware in their IT network. So that's the normal corporate network part. But when that happened, they shut down their OT network. That's that internal, stuff that's controlling all the valves and things. And pigs, if you've ever worked with pipeline stuff, they have these things called pigs, which go through the pipes to clean them out or to monitor them. And they shut the whole thing down as a safety precaution. There's still not very much information out there about the attack, but Mandy had said that DarkSide is a ransomware as a service provider that has launched campaigns in more than a dozen countries and targeted multiple industries. The shutdown shutdown caused President Biden to issue an emergency order. So this is separate from another story we're going to do. But Biden's emergency order allowed truck drivers to work outside of all the safety guidelines, and a combination of the shutdown and the hype in the media and so forth resulted in hoarders filling up everything from old boots to kiddie pools with gasoline. There were also quite a few instances of price gouging reported unofficially. I had several people that live in the Southeast telling me that, the local gas station was charged $7 a gallon and they were only selling premium and stuff like that. There were several days where there were no stations with gas in various places, so I've heard reports of that as well. Seems to be resolving, though. As of today, the pipeline was back up and running. I guess the truck drivers will have to go back to actually sleeping occasionally and so forth. On the heels of that, though, this had been promised for a while. U.S. President Joe Biden issued an executive order on Wednesday that was related to cybersecurity. If you read this thing, you'll realize it probably was not written in response to Colonial Pipeline because it's way too long. They had been promising this for several months now, and it contains a lot of new guidelines which will apply to federal agencies, contractors, and others that deal with the U.S. federal government. The order, which is incredibly lengthy, has things such as requiring cyber breaches to be reported and other vulnerabilities. It requires a coordinated sharing of cyber incident information within all the agencies, modernization of the federal government's cybersecurity. Talk about that one ought to cost some money. It did include priority for moving to cloud technology, zero trust, development of cloud security strategy, a cloud service governance framework, evaluation of unclassified data, multi-factor authentication and encryption for data at rest and in transit, a requirement that software contain a list of ingredients that goes on, and the order goes on. And I am just scratching the surface of this thing. But it also requires the establishment of a cyber safety review board to review and assess significant cyber incidents. Call me. Create a standardized playbook for the federal government for incident response. Improvement of detection of vulnerabilities and incidents on government networks. And I'm just reading the headers. Improve the investigative and remediation capabilities of the federal government. And all this, and here's the kicker on all this, the longest term allowed under this executive order was 1 year. A lot of these requirements were due within 90 days or less. So I guess they mean business. I do wonder if we can go from ancient, decaying, unsecured networks with no budget, no staff, etc. in 90 days. And work wonders. I guess. Read this thing if you dare, and then go look at like your local government and see, they don't deal with federal necessarily, but all that is just a chain of threats. So if the federal fixes theirs, but the state of Ohio doesn't do anything, you're going to have the same problems again. It's just going to change where it occurs. As threatened, Babook, a ransomware gang, has begun leaking Washington, D.C. Metropolitan Police Department files. Apparently, since they could not come to terms on the ransom that would be paid by the Metro Police Department, they started posting some of the files they have. It included personal files on officers, and then they made some additional threats. Reputedly, Babook was able to exfiltrate about 250 gigabytes of data from the department, which included investigations, arrest reports, police officer disciplinary action, and intel documents. All of this kind of ransomware now typically has exfiltration as a first step. So they pull everything before they encrypt it, and then they encrypt it so that they can do this sort of nastiness to you. In that light, we had extortion. That's it's ransomware. Then we have double extortion. So that's ransomware with exfiltration, so that they can then threaten to release your documents. Now we have triple extortion. So most of these ransomware as a service operations now use what is called triple extortion. It's 3 times more extortion than ever before. Your clothes have never been cleaner than with new triple extortion with Foolagon. Yep. Imagine that cyber criminals were smart enough to work all the angles. They do. So we now know what extortion is, and we know what double extortion is. That's when you don't pay that initial ransom. The ransomware gang basically sends you Bunny Lebowski's toe, meaning they release some of your private documents onto the dark web for sale. Well, triple extortion is when they contact the people whose data is in these files, and they tell them, hey, maybe your employer's not paying up, so you need to pay up as well, or we're going to release your personal data onto the dark web. And you know, like how that Tinder account you have under the name Carl Hungus that says you're 26 and drive a Bentley to go on long walks on the beach? Yeah, that kind of thing. It's only going to get worse until we can find ways to secure all these systems and figure out, that these 100-year-old, well, maybe not that old, but pretty old systems that are sitting around are not very secured. I mean, again, go check your town's cyber security budget, and you're probably going to find it's going to be pretty close to zero. More information about the net neutrality hearings in 2017. Basically, everyone was posting fake comments, pro and con. The New York Attorney General's office began investigating this in 2017, but they were unable to obtain evidence from the FCC. Chairman Ajit Pai, who declined to give them any information for whatever reason, even though it should be public information, just basically said, I'm not going to give it to you. But they finally have received all this information after Pai departed, and they found that millions of fake comments were filed on the matter. Apparently, the big ISPs who were in favor of, very strong favor of rolling back net neutrality rules. Those rules don't allow them to sell VIP access to their favorite sites. Included Comcast, Charter, AT&T, Cox, CenturyLink, and other trade groups that were all bundled together under a third-party name called Broadband for America. You got to give it a good name, right? If you give it a bad name, nobody will get into it. So you don't call it like Evil Nefarious Deeds for America. You call it Broadband for America. Think of the children. So anyway, the Broadband for America group hired out the work for around $4.2 million, which generated 8.5 million in comments to the FCC and 500,000 letters to be written to Congress in favor of rolling back the net neutrality rules. All fake. Now, because it was a third party, all the telcos go, we don't know what happened. We just gave them some money and told them to do their thing, and they must have done wrong things. So of the 22 million comments that were received about net neutrality, pro and con, about 18 million of them total were faked. 9.3 million were supporting net neutrality, and there were 8.5 million against it, all fake. And even though there were far more support than against keeping the net neutrality rules, they rolled them back anyway. But since everything was done by a third party, well, no one is to blame. Net neutrality forced the telcos to treat all sites equally, and they would far prefer to be paid to promote some sites over other sites, so that when you're looking for news stories, instead of getting this one, you get this other one over here. And then you always end up on certain sites more than others, so they would charge more for that. The rules were successfully rolled back despite public pressure, which it was a major initiative of former President Donald Trump's White House. But when that happened, states started passing local laws while the changes were still in court. And as of today, a lot of states have passed rules requiring net neutrality in their state. All this is, of course, still in court and probably will be for 1,000 years. Frag attacks are an old idea made new again, targeting 802.11 Wi-Fi standards. Apparently, the standards contain some design flaws in the frame aggregation and frame fragmentation functions of almost every Wi-Fi 802.11 device going all the way back into the 90s. So pretty much every device is at least subject to these vulnerabilities, according to Matti Vanhoff of New York University, Abu Dhabi. He was the discoverer of these problems. Attackers need to be in range of the device, though, to enact the attack. And the researcher did go on to say that these are mostly difficult to exploit. Some vendors are already releasing patches, but in the meantime, the use of HTTPS is a major mitigation of this type of attack, since it does involve collecting data and doing some things with that. Disabling fragmentation, pairwise rekeys, and so forth can be used to mitigate this as well on your device if it does not have a patch. The article has all the details of these various and sundry things. Intel announced this week that the Horse Ridge processor, a cryogenic control chip, has started to show tangible results in managing qubits. If you don't recall, qubits are bits that extend into the quantum space by being able to have more than two values. So the quantum part allows a kind of 0 bit with an upshift or a downshift so that it can represent more than a single thing. That's a pretty gross simplification of that, but that was what I felt like writing. Likewise, the 1 bit. So normally the problem with qubits is they require extremely cold temperatures in order to be persistent. And I'm talking really cold, like minus 273 centigrade, which is really hard environment to work in. And the controller chips don't function very well. And that's been a roadblock to quantum computing. But, you know, I mean, all of this is like, remember UNIVAC? It was the size of a house. Things change. Intel's been trying to solve this problem for a while and had developed a controller chip which could survive the cold. And when they did, that chip is named Horse Ridge, which is apparently a place in Oregon that is the coldest place in Oregon. The problem with the control chips not being able to take the cold environment had basically plagued most early quantum development. So this is a step forward, but don't expect to be setting up your latest Fortnite game on a quantum computer anytime soon. But hey, you know, they said that about UNIVAC as well, and it moved forward at the same time. And finally, Elon Musk is pumping Dogecoin and apparently calls himself the Doge Father. He and his mom plugged Dogecoin pretty hard on Saturday Night Live last weekend. Dogecoin, of course, is a cryptocurrency that originally started as a joke until Elon got involved and started tweeting about it. Now, Elon loves to mess with people, and he loves to mess with the markets, and that includes, you know, making tweets that cause stocks to go up and down and all kinds of stuff, all of which may be him, you know, doing something that he maybe shouldn't be doing. But he tweeted, working with Doge devs to improve system transaction efficiency, potentially promising, and that sent the coin value through the roof. He called the cryptocurrency a hustle on Saturday Night Live as well. Who knows? Anyway, I'm putting all my savings into Taco Cat coins. Who doesn't love tacos and cats, and maybe tacos made of cats? Maybe not. Anyway, we're off next week for RSA. Be sure to tune in to all the special RSA shows if you're lonely. And that's the news wrap-up for the week of 9 May 21 in the time of plague. The plague could be ending. Get your shots, and we'll see. See you next time on Security Weekly News.